Bienvenue au dialogue du Collège Massey. Massey College is a place for ideas. Its mission is to nourish learning and serve the public good. Massey College, the physical Massey, is located on Indigenous land for centuries. It is built on the cherished land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful for the ability to work here. Alors, bienvenue au Dialogue Massey. Today we'll have a very interesting conversation about the gig economy, about the workers that we see delivering our food and working often behind the scenes. So Uber Eats, Skip the Dishes, Uber Delivery, Uber drivers, all of them I think were used before the pandemic, but even more so during the pandemic in Canada, but also in France. And today I'm very happy to be joined by our guest, Professor Antonio Casilli, who is a professor of sociology at Telecom Paris, la Grande École de Télécommunications qui fait partie de l'Institut Polytechnique de Paris. He's a researcher at the Interdisciplinary Institute on Innovation and Institute of the French CNRS. Depuis 2017, il s'intéresse beaucoup à la question de la culture du numérique. Il tient un séminaire sur cette question. Il a écrit plusieurs livres, un qui s'appelle En attendant les robots. That sounds really fascinating. And the other one that it speaks to my heart, Against the Hypothesis of the End of Privacy. Plus récemment, il faisait partie de l'équipe d'experts pour une série télévisée de France TV, Invisible, les travailleurs du clic. So, thank you very much. Welcome, Professor Casilli. He will be joined today in our Massey dialogues, which, as you know, are built on the exchange between senior researchers like Professor Casilli, but also the younger researcher, the younger voice of Massey College, the students that are at Massey, and one of them is Julian Posada. He is a Ph.D. candidate at the Faculty of Information. Last year, he served as the Don of Hall, the 56th Don of Hall of Massey College. The Don of Hall is like the president of the Student Association here at Massey. His research combines sociology, political economy, software studies to explore the ethical organizational models for labor platforms and the implementation of AI into the online work. Il détient un bac et une maîtrise de l'Université Paris-Sorbonne et où il était aussi membre de l'équipe d'escrime. He was a fencing at Paris-Sorbonne. And I don't know whether he's been fencing in Canada, but will I get a chance to talk about this? And finally, we'll be joined by Brenda McPhail, who's the director of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association Privacy Surveillance Technology Project. She guides CCLA's interventions in key court cases on privacy cases. Her research focuses on the social implications of technology, the surveillance of dissent, government information sharing, digital surveillance, video surveillance, and the issue generally raised by artificial intelligence. Brenda holds a Ph.D. from U of T from the Faculty of Information in 2013. I'm still delighted to have someone from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association where I used to work. So it's a delight to have all of you. Ma première question sera donc pour le professeur Casilli. So I was just reading this morning that France is reopening its schools. So is the province of Quebec. What's the situation going on in France now, and with respect to the pandemic? Have you flattened the curve?
We are in the process of flattening the curve. The situation still is dire and complicated. We still have a quite remarkable number of people who die every day, but we are in the process of, seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. But we are also going ahead with the what is called the déconfinement, the end of the lockdown. So we are supposed to open the things that were closed, especially organizations and firms, and of course shops and several other productive activities, and of course schools and universities are a big question mark. Apart from these, there is another important and controversial topic that we're trying to deal with, which is also the digital tools that will be deployed in order to, track or trace the pandemic. So to fight against the pandemic. And one of these is an extremely controversial mobile app, which is intended to perform contact tracing, meaning to notify everybody who has been in touch with somebody who is declared and tested positive to COVID-19 that this person is probably at risk and has to be tested. And it is extremely controversial because of the privacy issues that are connected to this.
Can you just explain a little bit this app? I think I've read about it. I understand that. Do you have to have it? And if you decide not to have it, are you going to be subject to some penalties? And if you do have it, and all your neighbors and all the people you've been in contact with are collected, where does that data go after? Would be some questions.
Sure, these are very interesting questions, and I'm afraid that there is a certain gap between the answers we are able to provide today and the actual implementation of this app. First of all, it is important to understand that since the beginning of the pandemic, several countries have been trying to put into effect what can be described as tracking devices or tracking tools. China or South Korea, but also Poland and Israel and several other countries have been, effective, but also, in a disturbing way, let's say, to track people who were supposed to be in quarantine. Mm-hmm. So this is tracking. This is not what France and in general Europe is trying to do. Europe is trying to do something that is called tracing. Mm-hmm. Tracing, despite the fact that it's almost the same word, is an entirely different task, actually. Contact tracing is something that has been done for decades for several epidemic diseases. Think about, sexually transmissible diseases or TBC. And so contact tracing was basically something that doctors and health professionals, people who were called contact tracers, did. Meaning that they were interviewing somebody who was tested positive and then notifying the persons they got in touch with. Now, the app is supposed to do this, but in an automated way, which changes entirely the game, the nature of the game. Mm-hmm. Because first of all, the human in the loop is removed from the loop, and the human in this case is a health professional, somebody who is supposed to have a professional judgment about whom to notify and when and how. And of course, that changes everything. And in this case, these contact tracing apps are only supposed to activate when somebody is close enough, we talk about proximity, close enough to somebody who is tested positive. And then when this person is tested positive, this app is supposed to send a notification automatically to all the persons. Now, this is, of course, already from the technical point of view, a conundrum. because it's so difficult to avoid false positives, but also false negatives. False positives is somebody who has been close, for instance, not to you, but to your smartphone. Imagine you leave your smartphone on a table or in your purse or anywhere, and then forget about it, and somebody, walks by, and this person might find themselves notified after 14 days that they've been in touch with somebody, and they were not. But apart from these, the problem is that there is no entirely private or privacy compliant technology when it comes to contact tracing, because contact tracing, especially in a situation like this one, means dealing with sensitive data, health data. So I do have to have a permanent record of the fact that I have been tested positive, and then I also have records of the fact that I've been in touch with several persons. And these two are extremely sensitive data, because imagine, I don't know, that some of these persons are your significant others or members of your families, your children, for instance. These persons have to be protected. And even the fact of having a list of persons that you've been in proximity, meaning in physical proximity with, can become a privacy disaster. And so this is why we have been, discussing this, sometimes in a very, let's say, fiery way. It is not a quiet conversation. It is a controversy and a quite aggressive one. And in this case, the French government has decided to implement an app that is called Stop COVID. Quite self-explanatory, except that it doesn't do that. It does not stop it, and it just notifies persons, and it has to be intended as one part of a larger strategy to fight the pandemic. And unfortunately, the other elements of this strategy, for instance, testing and masks, are not here, because we are facing, like many other countries, let's say a certain shortage, or in this case, it's absence of masks for the civilians, and absence of tests, especially if compared to countries like South Korea, for instance.
Because if you receive the notification, then what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to go into quarantine for 14 days, or are you supposed to go to be tested? That would be the question, I guess. And
you are supposed to be tested, but in absence of tests, it's difficult.
That's difficult. So, and in Canada, we tend to think that Europe has a better privacy protection than we do. We admire some of the latest concepts that emerged from Europe. Was the privacy commissioner, is the privacy establishment looking at this? Have they most of the time a privacy establishment kind of puts sort of some safeguards around the use of it without banning it altogether? Has there been any discussion about managing it differently, the management of the tool?
Sure. First of all, in Europe, we have two pieces of legislation. The one called GDPR, the General Regulation for Private Data, and then the e-privacy regulation. Now, despite this, several voices from inside the European governments, the Italian one, the French one, the Spanish one, and despite Brexit also in Britain, are saying that we should not comply with GDPR because of these extraordinary circumstances. And then, of course, the role of the data protection authorities, like the CNIL in France or the Garante della Privacy in Italy, it is to be questioned in a way, because they have been, of course, effective in reminding that a certain number of provisions have to be respected and laws have to be complied, the app should comply by these laws. But unfortunately, they have been also extremely moderate. For instance, the French CNIL has said that the government has to show that this app is necessary, but in a way the door is open. So the only persons who are actually saying that we should not implement this app, and especially not inside the pocket of every citizen, because this is the main thing, are mainly civil liberties associations like the one I'm a member of, which is called the Quadrature du Net, which has been extremely vocal about this.
So, and vos travaux, your work is also about the gig economy, these invisible workers who are both delivering our food because they're mandated by an app, or the ones that were behind the scenes, kind of for Facebook and so on, to manage the economy. So what are they particularly, I mean, they are affected in terms of health risk. And earlier in these Massey dialogues, I think one of our interlocutor, Professor Owasa-Bampa, mentioned the fact that they are the lowest paid workers, the workers in Canada that sometimes come from visible minorities. So the structure of the workplace and the vulnerability is quite apparent here. Is that the same in France?
Yes, to an extent. Of course, we are dealing with workers who are contingent workers, first of all. Most of them are performing piecework. So even the kind of contractual, the kind of contract that they have with the platform is it's kind of strange, even for European legislations, national legislations. Mm-hmm. So they are a new type of pseudo-independent workers. And they are now facing a risk, but also they are in a situation where they are starting to be recognized more and more. The risk is there because, first of all, they go on working. Let's remember, let's just highlight the fact that teleworking or work from home is something that usually is performed by 25 to 30% of the workforce in several countries. These are basically the data we have for France, 25%. Of course, the other persons who are either facing unemployment or inactivity or go on working, well, they are in the, supermarkets, or they are in the logistic department. So they are performing what can be described as the last mile jobs. Last mile jobs are also this kind of platform jobs, delivering. But delivering is now presented by the platforms themselves as contactless delivery. Contactless delivery is, from the rhetorical point of view, a very diabolical turn of phrase, because it's contactless only for one person, for the consumer. It is not contactless for the rider. The rider still has to interact with persons who cook the meals, and then of course has to walk or ride through the city, and then has to touch several surfaces like doors and doorknobs and so on, which might expose these persons to contamination and becoming COVID-19.
Well, let me bring in Julian Posada here, because that's his subject of expertise. That's what you're studying, is these gig economy, these kind of workers that are behind the scenes making all of the net work. So what is it that, how does your work complement what Professor Casilli is working on? Oh, your mic. You have to turn on your mic.
Sorry. Well, it complements in many, many ways since we started working together a few years ago. So his latest work with research project Deep Lab, and he's been focusing on the what they call the micro workers in France. or in computer science, they're also known as the market is known as crowdsourcing or human computing. It's basically humans that step into train data or to verify machine learning systems or even to impersonate artificial intelligence. And these workers work online through platforms. Their labor is at source throughout the world, and in many cases they remain invisible for the platform for the people who request this labor. So just to very quickly summarize Professor Casilli's latest work, which is here not Popo. Well, his research, his theory is around platforms, around value extraction from users' data, global transactions of labor, and automation have been very important for my work, and especially the automation last mile, which is in the words of our colleague Mariel Gray and Cedar Suri, the humans that step in and remain visible. The automation last mile means that when you automate some tasks, actually you create some other tasks that need humans to step in, which is a paradox in the sense you try to remove the humans from the work when in the end you end up creating new tasks and need for more humans to step in and work. So that's basically the what I get from Professor Casilli's work overall. So
your own work is to continue to work on this, on studying the protection of these workers. But does COVID influence at all? Does it bring to light a little bit their plight? Do we know more? Are we more concerned about the gig economy now that we see it every day than we were before?
Indeed, in many cases, you can see that quarantine and confinement remains actually a privilege for many people. So I come from Colombia, which is a country with a huge informal sector. And despite the quarantine efforts, there's a lot of people who need to work because their jobs are actually part of the informal economy. So they don't have any protections or any way to stay at home without actually having an income. And we've had some recent studies being published very recently about the gig economy. For example, we have a survey from AppJobs who suggests that forms of gig work like online service, delivery, or freelance have actually doubled, tripled, or even more. The demand for this kind of work. But since the demand of work increases, also the amount of workers requesting these jobs or doing these jobs also increases. So in many cases, actually for the workers, that means that they're actually losing their jobs. There's a recent study from the Fair One Foundation who was published a couple of days ago, and I quote from their findings. It says that an estimated 50 million gig workers worldwide have been particularly hard hit by the COVID pandemic. Reports indicate half have lost their jobs. Those still working have lost 2/3 of their income on average, and many face the impossible choice between destitution and infection. As summed up by one worker, and I quote this worker, either I'm starving or I'm dying of coronavirus. And these colleagues have done surveys with these workers to see how their income and how some protections have been evolving on COVID. And what happened is that we see a constant trend of platforms of benefiting their clients at the expense of workers. And this is actually how the platform model works, which is something that in academia we call network effects. That platforms give a lot of incentives and a lot of help aids to the clients. So, for example, you have Uber who gives a lot of $10 discounts, or Facebook or other big platforms who allow you to use their services for free or low cost. And in many times, it's the workers who end up paying from lack of protections or low salaries, this kind of incentives for clients. And we have an example here in Canada with Foodora, who's leaving the market in a few weeks, despite the surge in demand. And they don't say especially, they say the market is very hard in Canada, but what some people are suggesting is that they're actually leaving in part because of the unionization of the workers who became members of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers in 2019. So in many cases, these business models are actually built on the precarization of work.
Yeah. Well, this is actually, it's an issue that we'll have to continue to study, because how do we adapt our labor laws to actually protect these workers is a huge issue that we'll need to pick up. But I want to bring in Brenda on the privacy side. We've heard about the app in France. What's going on in Canada?
Well, I'm fascinated as I listen to Antonio to observe that we're following a somewhat parallel course in some ways. So in Canada, of course, we have emergency measures acts declared in every province and territory across the country, and an increasing conversation that's happening in all of those places and at the federal government level to assist in being able to lift some of those emergency provisions is contact tracing. It's the idea that maybe there's an app that will help us fight the virus and solve some of our problems. And of course, from a privacy perspective and from a civil liberties perspective, CCLA is out warning that there is no privacy protective silver bullet in the form of a technological fix for this virus. In Canada, rather than just a single government-sponsored app, what's happening is that all the different provinces and territories are in conversations with a wide range of third-party vendors and research teams who are trying to create these applications and then pitch them to governments. And so there's a plethora of potential features that they may have. So some of these apps do include location tracking and others do not. Some of these apps are being developed in conjunction with somebody from a public health agency and some are not. Some of them involve the kind of push notifications that Antonio was talking about that would, notify people who had been in contact with someone who had tested positive that they should go get tested. Some of them instead do notifications potentially in addition to notifying people, would send notifications or lists of potentially infected people directly to public health. So there's just this big morass of potential features and accompanying potential privacy risks and risks to other human rights as well. Because we should be clear that while we talk a lot about privacy in relation to this tracing, privacy is a gateway right. Because if we don't have control over our personal information, it means that others can judge our associations with others. Others can potentially judge what we say. Others can potentially judge where we go, and that impacts our mobility. So there's serious privacy risks, and one of the reasons we care so very much about the privacy risks is because it has knock-on effects for other rights.
So just so that I understand, so as of now, no government has decided which app they're going to recommend or implement. So we're still so it's the right time to be thinking about all the additional protection we would like to do. Are the privacy commissioners involved at all in these conversations? I assume they would be. Have they come out on anything?
So in Canada, the Federal Privacy Commissioner last week released a set of guidelines that he would want to see implemented in relation to any kind of contact tracing efforts. In Alberta, which is the province is the only province in Canada which has formally made an announcement that the government is shortly going to be agreeing upon and promoting an app, they issued a statement that basically said, we're going to do this, and we've been talking with our privacy commissioner. Okay. And it was rather extraordinary that the day they released that announcement, the privacy commissioner herself released a notice saying, actually, we've heard high-level conversations about this, but that's all. We've been told there'll be a privacy impact assessment. We look forward to seeing it. Okay. So that's as close as you're going to get with the regulator to saying, hold up there, we haven't really been involved, and we really want to be.
So are there technological possibilities in terms of protection? Are they things we should be asking from these apps? And what would there be from your perspective? And I invite all the others to jump in here. So Brenda, what would you ask?
Okay, Well, first of all, I mean, I really like Antonio's distinction between tracking and tracing, because I think some of the applications that we're talking about in Canada really blur that line. So the first act would be it absolutely has to be about tracing and only for purposes of public health. CCLA has actually done a letter to all the Prime Minister and all of the First Ministers in Canada, where we've laid out a series of requests that we think should be put in place. And first of all, it's got to be, surveillance as data surveillance of individuals, whether it's tracing or tracking, as an absolute last resort, where there's meaningful consent, not coerced consent, where the objective is purely about public health, where it can be shown to be necessary based on the requirements of public health and not the speculative requirements that an app developer might think we need, where there's some demonstrable potential for effectiveness. And here, the comments that Antonio was making about whether or not there's enough testing in place to back up the app is really important, because in Canada, we're very behind on testing. We don't have the capacity. And if all of a sudden a contact tracing app was out in the wild generating hundreds of potential contacts a day, the testing system would be overwhelmed. And then we've got, a list of things about privacy commissioner involvement. And the last one I'll say is we think it's very important that any information collected for private health be firewalled from any other use. So no police use, no justice system use, no national security use. Only public health.
So is that something that is that the similar type of issues that you're seeing in France that your group is advocating for?
Yes, but in this case, I would say that especially the data authorities in Europe, because it is not only France, it's a European dynamics, and it concerns. I mean, it is something that is going on in Germany, in Italy, Spain, and several other countries like Austria and the smaller ones too. But mainly the idea is that these data authorities have insisted on the fact that these apps should be GDPR compliant, meaning they should respect the privacy regulation which is in place, which is a minimum. But then again, some governments are insisting that they should not. And then secondly, and this is a very important point, that this app should be actually implemented on a voluntary base. It is very important that we stress each term of my last sentence, actually implemented on a voluntary base. First of all, several countries have tried this. Well, the example we have is actually Singapore, who has already tried to put in place an app called Trace Together, a contact tracing app. And first of all, it was actually implemented on a voluntary basis. Not only 12% of the population downloaded it. As to the effectiveness of it, well, you probably know that Singapore had to go back in lockdown, so it didn't work. Secondly, the voluntary element is so important, and this is probably is a segue for Julian, for several persons, because it's really voluntary. It opens to discrimination. And in France especially, we are experts in discrimination. Let me give you an example. Discrimination means that imagine a situation where somebody is free to, well, circulate everywhere if this person has the app installed in his or her smartphone. And others, those who do not have it because they do not have a smartphone or because they refuse to download it, they probably should face, stay-at-home orders or go on staying in quarantine. This is, of course, discrimination. Think about a situation where a supermarket or a bus refuses you access if you do not have installed the application. This is fake voluntary scenario, which is scary and unfortunately very French. Because France, for instance, has a history with this, with voluntary tools that become compulsory and eternal. The example is something that is called le plan Vigipirate, Plan Vigipirate is an anti-terrorism stop and frisk situation where basically people at the entrance of shopping mall or school would stop you and ask you to open your bag, or they could, for instance, I don't know, check if you have things in your pockets and so on, or show an ID. This is supposed to be on a voluntary basis. It is written in the law. And unfortunately, the way it is
implement. Well, we have.
The way it is
so we're losing you. So we're going to. I have to say that we have the same pretend voluntariness in Canada in many shopping malls and entrance to different buildings. So Julian, any comments on this problematic of the privacy of both the workers and the vulnerable in our society?
Well, with the gig economy, it's a long-term discussion in the sense that in many cases, these apps, these platforms are not only about the services they're offering. So, for example, Uber is not only about ride-hailing, about transportation. Since, as we've seen before, over and over, platforms are the main way for technology companies to access data from humans, data that is then destined to artificial intelligence, machine learning solutions. So in many cases for these workers, the surveillance of the work is constant, and it's always been a constant. And it's the same for managerial purposes. So the apps becomes the manager, the algorithms become the manager. And what happens in many cases is that since these apps thrive on the idea that these are not their workers, legally speaking, that these are just users or what they call independent contractors, so they don't have any protection or any voice on the platform. So surveillance is a given for most gig work, for either managerial purposes or for data collection purposes.
Is that an area where the CCLA could, as intervener, could intervene in terms of protection of these workers who are constantly surveilled? It's no different than being tested at work.
Well, it's true, and actually this casts back to my thesis research, oddly enough, because I worked on ubiquitous surveillance of frontline workers, only I wasn't looking at gig workers, I was looking at call center workers. Mm-hmm. And I mean, all of these problems that are increasingly arising in relation to gig work and being really highlighted during this pandemic are issues that have been around for at least the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. For frontline workers and workplace surveillance. We have, in Canada at least, laws that give employers a lot of leeway in terms of the information that they're allowed to collect and the way that they're allowed to monitor the work of their employees. Mm-hmm. We foster the truly illusory concept that employees have a choice about where they work, and if they don't like the policies of their workplace, that they can do something else. Certainly, in the current pandemic economy, we all know that that's a fallacious kind of assumption. So I think that in terms of what CCLA would do, it's really difficult to lobby in Canada, at least, for changes to workplace laws. But there's an approach that I'm interested in considering in terms of lobbying generally around the data surveillance economy that's increasingly come up. And during the pandemic, of course, it's not just gig workers, but all members of the public who are now being pushed to live their work lives online that are using the very platforms that over the last couple of years have been revealed to be deeply privacy invasive, collecting all kinds of information that we don't really understand and using it for purposes that we don't really know. So I think that the pandemic, in a way, has opened up a window to the fact that we're all precariously positioned in this kind of data economy.
So you mentioned, Professor Casilli, earlier that your organization was advocating for compliance of this new app, this tracing app with the law. what would it mean if it complied with the law? What would be the requirements that would be in it? That would be.
Sorry, to be precise, I was echoing what the CNIL, meaning the data protection, and several other data protection authorities were saying. Complying with GDPR and with the e-privacy regulation means mainly that we have to make sure that there is, first of all, consent, and then secondly, that these data are treated and collected. Treated means analyzed. In a way which is transparent, and of course also that we probably have to stop saying that the data collected and analyzed by those apps are anonymized. They are at best pseudonymized, meaning that we can come up with a pseudonym, meaning an ephemeral identifier that instead of my own name and civil identity says, 123AB. But again, this is not anonymous insofar as, there is somewhere a database that has to match my identity with my identifier. Unless, and I would not go into this very technical discussion, a specific protocol is put in place, which now some people are trying to.
We're losing you a little bit, so I'm going to go and get from the audience, and hopefully we can. So we have George Isaac Vargas Gonzalez, who asked, how will COVID-19 reshape the gig economy for the next years? Is it possible to know? Let's start with Julian. Any ideas about whether that's an opportunity for change, or how will it change? How COVID will change the gig economy?
Well, COVID has already changed the way we engage with online work in many cases. So this surge in demand, the trend right now is skyrocketing because of COVID. But in many cases, people are discovering online work as an alternative. So maybe the market, there's a shift in the market that I don't think will remain the same as in pre-COVID. So that's one thing. But also, in many cases, COVID is also making the invisible workers research, so people will see them in many cases. We have an example in Milan with gig workers all over the place because they are the only means for many people to acquire goods and services. So that's one of the things I believe the market will change due to COVID.
In Europe, there has been some virtual walkouts of workers, of the gig workers, protesting, wanting to have better protection. What are they asking for?
Well, first of all, they are not virtual. I mean, in some cases there have been digital strikes, but recently in Spain and actually in several other Spanish-speaking countries, we have seen actual huelgas, meaning strikes of riders. Imagine a situation in a city like Madrid, desert because of the lockdown, and all of a sudden you see hundreds of riders on bikes and scooters protesting against the pay cuts. Basically, what is happening is that because there is more labor offers, meaning a lot of persons want to work, these platforms are trying to cut the rates, the pays. And so in this case, one in particular called Glovo has prompted a strike that has involved workers in Spain, but also in Uruguay, Peru, Guatemala, and several other countries last week.
So there's resistance in a way from the workers. So
and organization. They are organizing effectively because of what Julian was just saying. They are now visible in a situation where you do not see the rest of the crowd. you only see these kind of workers because they are the only one who are working every hour of the day, basically, and every day of the week.
So one of the issues that comes with surveillance is what happens to the data after. We know, all organizations that are civil liberties organizations wants the data to be used only for the purposes for which the information was sought. But then we are always worried that this data will leak out and be used by different authorities. Do we have examples of that, or is that something that is the same demand being asked in Europe? Is that a concern in Europe as well?
Okay, I suppose this is for me. Well, this is something that is, of course, of concern here in Europe. Of course, the governments are trying to, show that they will treat this data in the best possible way. One way is using digital sovereignty, meaning only data centers and platforms who are inside a specific country, which is, to me, not enough as a guarantee. Even if we remove from the equation the big, scary tech companies such as Google or Apple, who are actively trying to enter the COVID surveillance game. Even if we remove those, we still have the possibility of having this data not specifically leak, because again, I want to trust them, but being matched with other data. Imagine a situation where the app, which is entirely pseudonymous, is matched with data which are, for instance, from another app, which is a kind of a parasite app, which, is able to say, okay, this is the list of your contacts, and from my app can come, for instance, the list of all the locations you were with, and we match them, and all of a sudden this becomes even more of a privacy nightmare. And this is not is just a nightmare scenario. It is something that is happening in some countries. It is happening in Korea, in South Korea, for instance, where the government is being extremely quick, swift, and effective, according to their philosophy of pali-pali, doing things quickly. But they have been probably too open, because after they implemented their tracking app, several persons have been trying to develop parasite apps that give you, for instance, the possibility of knowing if around you, in the radius of 100 meters, there is somebody who is COVID positive. Or in some cases, you can even follow the GPS location or the data roaming location of somebody who has been declared positive. This, again, is a major violation, not only of privacy, but also of human rights.
Yeah. And also it leads to snitch lines and could lead to vigilante justice. Is that a concern? Have you seen something in Canada that resembles that, or Brenda?
Well, certainly snitch lines are an issue in Canada. We're increasingly seeing them being rolled out, and the social impacts are predictable and they're happening. So you see stories about, the one that hit me recently was a story about a mom who let her kids play in her own backyard and had the police called on her by a neighbor because she had two children, and the neighbor wasn't completely sure that both children belonged in the same household. And one of the strictures we're facing in Canada is you can only be within 6 meters or 2 meters or 6 feet of someone if you belong in the same household. The problem with snitch lines is not just nastiness between neighbors. It's that one of the ways that Canada has been coping with this crisis as a mature democracy is there's a lot of willingness to follow strictures and restrictions and authoritative requests that are grounded in public health for the common good. Snitch lines erode that sense of being all in it together for the common good. So I think that they're problematic that way. I mean, that's a knock-on effect of that kind of surveillance.
Well, the other things with all this surveillance is it could be hacked. It could give us a false sense of security if indeed it doesn't work well. Is that a concern that has been raised throughout? Like, are there instances where the surveillance that's being done for workers is just not, there's mistakes in it, and there's people are prejudiced because of the technology not working and delivering the result it was supposed to deliver? Let's start with Julian and then go to Antonio. Yes, Julian.
Yeah, one of the huge concerns of the platform economy is when they become utilities. When people rely on them so heavily that when they stop working, they have huge consequences for everyone. A recent example here in Toronto was when Uber Eats stopped working the last weekend, and a lot of businesses that were relying on the platform were having massive losses of income because of that. So this is a huge ongoing problem about the platformization of the economy and society when when people become so reliant on these platforms for their daily lives. And this is the case also with transportation and other types of work. So there is a huge debate whether when these platforms become a public utility, then what is the engagement of society with these platforms in those circumstances?
Antonio, what's your comments on that?
Well, let me answer in a slightly oblique way. First of all, it is not only a platform economy issue. Surveillance is on the rise in every sector and for every category of workers. Imagine telework. This is something that, especially when performed via privacy invasive and security defective platforms such as Skype or Zoom. Sorry, we are using Skype, full disclosure. This is also, of course, problematic, especially because employers are now trying to implement for people who work from home surveillance systems that rely, for instance, on new pieces of software that are able to take screenshots of what you are doing to make sure that you are actually teleworking and not doing your stuff. So this is one category. And the other one is, of course, the people who work outside of their home. The people who perform proximity jobs, people that have to be in touch in some cases with the general population because they work in supermarkets or in hospitals. And on those people too, on this kind of workers too, surveillance is rising, especially, for instance, in supermarkets and shopping malls and commerce in general, especially because now there are a number of rights and, for instance, additional pays if you perform this kind of job. So employers have to make sure, or want to make sure, that these workers are actually performing the job, and they are even, following them every day in a more invasive way.
Mm. So we're coming to the end of our show. So I'm going to ask you to kind of give me a couple of remarks in terms of what you think would be the future and what we should remember from this conversation and act upon. But before we do that, the big invention from Europe was the right to be forgotten. The idea that maybe we'll be surveilled, maybe we'll disclose all sorts of information, but every so often we should be able to press the erase button and not have this information being kept about us forever and used against us in job searches and so on. Is it in place in Europe? Is the right to be forgotten part of the vocabulary, part of the way the industry is structured, or is it still a little bit of an abstract concept?
It is an abstract concept that has some practical manifestation. And for instance, if somebody wants to be deranked from a search engine, this is one practical manifestation. But I'm afraid that in this case, it does not entirely apply. I am not a law expert, but I actually tend to consider that in this case, we are facing a risk of pervasive and extremely long surveillance. And we are now in a situation where the scenario is a scenario of conflict, is a scenario of struggles to defend, to protect our privacy and a struggle to protect our rights as workers and as human beings. COVID-19 has made our everyday task of having our rights respected even more difficult. And I wouldn't say the silver lining, but the only thing that is also happening is that more and more persons are becoming aware of the fact that privacy violation and surveillance, they do exist, that people do not want to renounce their privacy. And so the more and more are joining the fight, so to say.
So, Brenda, any comments? So, what about the right to be forgotten in Canada? Is there a pathway towards it?
Well, there are some interesting conversations happening now about the right to be forgotten. The Privacy Commissioner of Canada argues that you can read a certain degree of a right to be forgotten into our current private sector privacy legislation, PIPEDA, and that question, a reference question, is before the court that will help us explore whether or not that's the case, and CCLA has applied to intervene in that case. But I think I agree that in this current situation, the right to be forgotten probably isn't going to help us a lot. And what we see in Canada is, unlike in Europe, where at least they have the GDPR, which is a relatively recent, up-to-date and modern privacy piece of legislation, in Canada we're dealing with legislation that is gravely out of date. People have been calling for updates to our privacy laws in Canada for the last 15, 20 years. And so we're in a situation where the privacy risks have never been higher, where we've got governments across the country looking to find technological fixes that involve tracing people or possibly tracking them, and laws that possibly aren't entirely up to the task. So that's my concern.
Julian, any comments on this issue of what should we remember from this discussion? What is it that's left to be done? Updating our privacy laws.
Well, I would like to echo actually one of the main arguments of Professor Casilli in his work, which is that automation is not an issue of people just being destroyed by machines, but actually of people being displaced. And it's not an issue of quantity, but of quality. And what we've seen with the gig economy right now, it's just some visible trends that have been existing for decades and decades of precarious jobs being the norm, which has always been in history. Has been the norm. The informal economy has been the norm for most of the people in the world. And what COVID has shown to us is just that, for example, how current quarantine is a privilege, and the issues that the social divisions that exist, that emerge, that are more visible now, but that have always been there for decades, is something that we have to think about in the future, especially in terms of labor and labor issues.
Final comments from you, Professor Casilli, before I close.
Well, it has been extremely interesting, and I want to thank you all. I would only probably again stress what Julian has been trying to deal with, meaning behind all this, behind the privacy concerns and behind the workers' struggles, there is a looming threat, which is automation. I wouldn't say it is a threat per se, but the way it is used, politically speaking, it can become dangerous. In this case specifically, automation means that for workers, their contribution is considered as irrelevant and only machines produce. And we tend to forget that humans are extremely important in the productive chain. And secondly, also when it comes to privacy and also when it comes to these contact tracing apps, it is a matter of automation, because the question that nobody asks is what kind of algorithms are going to analyze this data. Yes, I can be tested positive, but who and what kind of algorithm is going to decide which person is notified and what happens next. This is a matter of governance of these artificial intelligence systems, and of course governance of the technology at large.
Well, no shortage of future Massey dialogues that we should have on these questions. I think they are transformative of our society in terms of how we pursue our privacy protection, how we care about workers that are invisible and in such vulnerability, and how, in fact, this transformation of our economy and automation raises new issues of governance. I think those are all good questions that we should pursue. It's interesting that next week we'll have a bit the other